Okay, well, welcome to everyone who is with us this evening. Welcome to our Let's Talk About Hanford episode with the subjects of our A242 evaporator and LERF ETF complex or facilities. I am Ginger Wireman. I am an outreach and education specialist with the Department of Ecology's nuclear waste program. I've been with ecology for 20 years. And we used to be able to do a lot of outreach to classrooms and Rotary clubs and such, and that's starting to come back. But we came up with this Let's Talk programming to give the public an opportunity to learn more about Hanford and our role in the cleanup. And so this is, what is this, our sixth one, I think. I'm going to introduce my colleague Ryan Miller to give you some housekeeping tips and ideas, and then we will get back to the program proper. Ryan, go ahead.
Thanks, Ginger. Hello, everyone. My name is Ryan Miller. I'm the communications manager for the nuclear waste program here at Ecology. So the structure of these events has been the same. We're going to start with a presentation covering the 242A evaporator, the Liquid Effluent Retention Facility, and the Effluent Treatment Facility by, Eddie Holbrook and Andrew Pomiak. And then we'll move into a live Q&A session with all of you in attendance. And at that point in time, if you're on the Zoom call, I'll go ahead and grant the permission so that participants can unmute themselves and turn on their video if you wish to ask your questions to us. If you're on the Facebook live chat, you can feel free to put in your questions or comments at any time during tonight's event. If you're on the Zoom meeting, you can put in your comments at any time as well. And then, like I just mentioned, once we get to the live Q&A chat, if you're on Zoom, you have the option to either put your questions into the chat box, or you can unmute yourself and ask your questions over audio as well. So we'll give you both options there. And we would like to remind folks that these events are geared to be a little more high level to help you understand Hanford topics. And again, tonight's topics will cover LERF, ETF, and the 242A evaporator, and what they are, ecology's role with these facilities, and their importance for Hanford cleanup. We do ask that you please gear your questions to these facilities specifically, as that's the topic of discussion tonight and who our experts are involved with. If you ask questions that relate to other facilities or cleanup projects, we're going to have to probably take those questions to either a future event, or we can follow with you privately after the event to answer those questions, since that's not the focus of tonight's event. If you do have questions that aren't pertaining to tonight's event, you can email them directly to us at hanford@ecy.wa.gov, and we're happy to answer them. But again, please, during tonight's event, please put any questions or comments you have at any time into either the Zoom chat or the Facebook live chat, depending what stream you're on. And I think with that, we can go ahead and kick it back to Ginger, who will introduce our speakers. But I also want to note that if you're on the Zoom chat, I think I turned on the live transcription feature, but if you're not seeing it, I believe if you're a participant, there should be some box on your Zoom bar that allows you to turn on the transcript if you would like to see live captioning tonight. But yeah, Ginger, I'll kick it back to you.
All right. Well, I'm happy to introduce my colleagues, Andrew Pomiak and Eddie Holbrook. Andrew is our permit lead for the 242 evaporator, and he'll give you a little brief bio before he kicks off on his part. And then Edward Holbrook, our waste management section manager, will follow him with information about the LERF and ETF facilities, and also give a little bio, because we've had outside people, and so we always thought to get their bios, and it didn't occur to me that we don't have bios for Andrew and Eddie. So go ahead and take it away, Andrew. And Dina will bring up the slides, I think.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining tonight. My name is Andrew Pomiak. I am the environmental permit lead for the 242A evaporator. I've been with the nuclear waste program just over 7 years. I've been leading multiple sections in the office and for multiple unit groups throughout the office. And now I'm with the evaporator and filling in for double shell tank systems lead. And so I'll be given a presentation here on the evaporator as soon as Dana brings it up. There we go. let's talk about Hanford. So 242A evaporator. You can go ahead and go to the next slide. Here is a drawing of the Hanford facility in green and light green in Southeast Washington. I think most people on the chat are familiar with the Hanford site, but for those who aren't, it's bordered the north and east by the Columbia River, by a couple highways to the west, and Richland is just on the southern tip of Hanford there. The evaporator, the 242A evaporator, or I'll likely call it the evaporator throughout this presentation. The evaporator is located in 200 East area there, about in the center of the site. Next slide, Dana. Here is a picture of the outside of the building. The building was constructed in 1974 and started operations in 1977, treating tank waste out at Hanford. The evaporator is a very important part of managing tank waste in that it reduces tank waste volume in specific tanks, and that aids in retrievals and blendings and transferring of tank waste throughout the Hanford site. The evaporator is a conventional forced circulation vacuum evaporation system. I'll get into more detail and explain a bit more about that in later slides. Currently, the evaporator is permitted to treat and store tank waste and hazardous waste in 2 separate tank systems in the building. Next slide, please, Dana. Tank waste is staged in a double shell tank system AW102. AW is the farm identifier. 102 is the second of 2 tanks within AW farm. So waste is transferred into the AW102 tank and staged for treatment in the evaporator. The treatment generates 2 dangerous waste streams. One is a concentrated tank waste slurry that is transferred back to the DST system. And the second dangerous waste stream is processed condensate, which is stored in a tank in the 242A evaporator and then transferred via waste lines to the liquid effluent retention system, or LERF basins, for further treatment. The way that the evaporator works is that waste is introduced to the system, heated in a reboiler to about 125 degrees Fahrenheit, and then under a vacuum drawn across what is called the vapor liquid separator. This heated waste is evaporated on the top of the separator, drawn through a line and into the condensing system. And the overheads from the separator are then condensed in a train of 3 different condensers. And that condensed overheads are then stored in a storage tank in the 242A evaporator building and then transferred to LERF. Next slide, please. So this is a pretty simplified drawing. It's not a very complicated system, but it works really hard. It has treated a lot of waste in the past. It treats, it's a pretty vigorous system in how much waste it can treat at any given time. It's much like a distillation unit. And so in this drawing, you can see the AW102 feed tank. That is where the tank waste for treatment is stored. It is transferred to the evaporator, where it says recirculation pump. About there is about the end of the building wall. So the rest of the components are contained within the evaporator building. The tank waste is then, you can see the red arrows showing the directions of waste. So once it's in what is called the recirculation loop, the recirculation pump pumps the waste up through the reboiler, where steam is used to heat it to a specific temperature. That waste is then pushed into the vapor liquid separator or the separator vessel. And that is kind of a cork colored here in the cutaway of the separator. A vacuum is drawn by the condensers, and this waste, which is heated to 125 degrees, is then evaporated at a lower temperature than boiling point of water for safety purposes. The vacuum draws overheads off the top of the separator and into the, it says primary condenser here. There are also 2 subsequent condensers for any straggling evaporator overheads that have not condensed. Cooling water or raw water is used in the condensers to condense the overheads, and those condensed overheads drop via gravity to a tank at the bottom below the condensers, and then a pump is installed in this tank and transfers the liquid process condensate to LERF. Back to the recirculation loop, the colder waste in the separator settles to the bottom and is drawn via the recirculation pump back through the recirculation pump and back into the reboiler for heating. And so a campaign, which may last a few days, slowly heats and recirculates the waste, drawing off specific amounts from the top of the separator. And then you can see in this drawing here, there is another line that goes to another, it looks like a Lego piece, which is another pump. This is the slurry pump. And once specific criteria are met in the tank waste in the recirculation loop, portions of that, which is now called slurry or concentrated tank waste, is drawn off via that little Lego piece, which is a slurry pump. And that slurry pump pumps it back to the DST system. And so that is how the evaporator essentially treats tank waste out on site. Next slide, please, Dana. There are 2 other non-dangerous waste streams generated at the evaporator, amongst PPE and you know, traditional just household garbage from the cafeteria and other things. The non-dangerous process wastes are steam condensate. The steam is used in the reboiler to heat up the waste. And then used raw water, which was used in the condensers as cooling water, is also discharged from the facility. Treatment occurs in batches, and they're called campaigns. And so prior to any campaigns being conducted, the amount of waste and type of waste is designated by the permittee and staged in AW 102. And it could be a blending of various DSTs to get to a specific concentration of which needs to be treated. Then they take samples in AW 102 and they bench scale evaporate them at the 222S laboratory out on site. They conduct many campaigns within the evaporator to determine, essentially the evaporator concentrates DST tank wastes. So these bench scale tests determine the final concentration of the tank waste via specific gravity that they're going to shoot for in campaigns. And then during the treatment, during the campaign at the evaporator, the slurry is returned to the DST system, as I said, and then the system is flushed with water and then prepared for the next campaign. Next slide, please, Dana. And that is it for the evaporator. I do see that there is at least one question in the Zoom chat box, but I think that's going to be facilitated towards the end of the meeting for those answers. And thank you very much. On to LERF.
All right, that's my cue. So the Liquid Effluent Retention Facility and Effluent Treatment Facility are located in the 200 area, and we'll see that on the next slide. So just east of the 200 East area, you'll find both of these facilities, and I'll refer to them as LERF and ETF going forward because it is a mouthful for both of them. So next slide. So as you can see in the picture here, the LERF basins comprise of 3 basins that are operational right now and a 4th one being constructed as of today. The activities for finishing that construction are wrapping up here for the 4th basin, Basin 41, which will support DFLAW activities down the line here. At the bottom of the picture, you'll find the Effluent Treatment Facility, which receives aqueous waste from the LERF basins for treatment, both in the primary treatment train and the secondary treatment train. The Effluent Treatment Facility processes liquid waste to remove chemical and radioactive contaminants. Next slide. So there are a number of aqueous wastes that are received at LERF and treated at ETF. Below is a list of some of the recurring typical aqueous waste you'll find received by the LERF basins and also treated at ETF. So I'll give folks a chance to read that list. Next slide, please. So as I had mentioned earlier, there are currently 3 basins that are operational, 44, 43, and 42, and the 4th basin, 41, which is currently under construction. The basins themselves can accept up to 7.8 million gallons of aqueous waste. And there are a number of transfer lines throughout the Hanford site that lead into the basins themselves. From the 200 West area, the 242A evaporator, ETF loading station, the sampling port connections, and then also with WTP operations coming online, there is a transfer line for that as well. Next slide. So the effluent treatment facility comprises of a number of buildings. The primary and secondary treatment trains fall within the middle building there, 2025E. And the primary treatment train removes and destroys dangerous and radioactive waste components that are found in the aqueous waste from the basins themselves. And the secondary treatment train concentrates the components that are removed from the aqueous waste. And currently, it concentrates them down into a dried powder that is managed as hazardous waste. The brine concentrate is something that will come online here within the near future, but that particular facility is still under construction activities. Next slide. So it may be a little hard to see, but as you can see in the diagram here, the primary treatment train is in blue, and it has a number of treatment technologies that it goes through to destroy and remove hazardous and radioactive constituents. Next slide. And on that same diagram in green, you'll find the secondary treatment train, which is used to concentrate those constituents that are removed into a dried powder. And as you can see there, the brine loadout station is still under construction. So it will be operational here in the near future once permitting and construction activities are completed. Next slide. All right, so you'll see here, once the primary treatment train reaches its endpoint, the wastewater is stored in verification tanks to ensure it meets the criteria for the wastewater discharge permit. We typically call it ST 4500. And that wastewater, once verified, is as non-dangerous. It's disposed of under that wastewater discharge permit. The secondary treatment train and the white powder and eventually the brine itself will be determined whether it's dangerous waste or not, and then sent off for further treatment and disposal. Next slide. All right, and I think I made a little mistake, Brian. I probably should have given myself a little bio there, so I could do that now. A little too little, too late. But so my name is Eddie Holbrick. I am the Waste Management Section Manager. I am coming up on 1 year as the Waste Management Section Manager here in 2 days. Previously, I was with the nuclear waste program as a compliance inspector under the tri-party agreement section. So in total, I've been with Ecology for about a little over 5 years now.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Eddie, and thank you so much, Andrew, for your presentations. We'll go ahead and move into the live Q&A session. Also note that we have Amanda on as well from our agency, and she'll be available to answer questions about LERF and ETF. So go ahead and if you haven't put any questions into the chat yet, go ahead and put it into the chat on either Zoom or on Facebook Live. If you want to unmute and turn on your video and ask a question, you're more than free to do that as well. I'll provide a couple opportunities for folks to turn on the cameras or unmute themselves and ask their question, or you can just put into the chat that you want to ask a question, and I'll make sure that that I have you queued up. And I'll go ahead and have Ginger. She'll go ahead and ask the Zoom questions, and I'll take on Facebook. And while she asks the first question, I'll change the permissions on Zoom so that participants can unmute and turn on their cameras. So Ginger, you want to ask our first question? Don't know if we lost Ginger, but I'll go ahead and ask the first one. This first question comes from Jeff Wyatt, and Jeff asks, what is the typical tank waste feed composition and the composition of the treated slurry? And this one should be for you, Andrew.
Good question. There is lots that go in to determine candidate feed for the evaporator. There are many internal DOE documents which specify limits. Many considerations are made for the types of feed that would go to the evaporator. There's operational concerns, such as physical solids formations of the waste feed that may hinder the evaporator. There's criticality issues, which DOE must entertain when choosing a candidate feed tank. Flammable gas, just got really dark on my video. Flammable gas considerations, which obviously would pose a problem in the evaporator. Then there is considerations for LERF acceptance, because process condensate is generated to the evaporator and sent down to LERF. The candidate feed tank is sampled and then analyzed for what possible concentrations may be in the process condensate going down to LERF. There's vessel vent, uncondensed vapors from the condenser system is discharged to the environment through the vessel vent at the evaporator, and there's specific ammonia concentrations that they cannot go over in those emissions. So that is analyzed during the tank feed. Essentially, the evaporator, it runs a wide gamut of tank waste, but it has to be liquid. And is analyzed prior to the start of the campaign to ensure that it meets all of these different criteria. And then the composition of the treated slurry is essentially that of the tank feed, the feed tank waste composition. less water and other volatiles and organics that had been evaporated and condensed off of the slurry. So it's essentially the same tank waste at a higher specific gravity and concentration.
Awesome. Thanks, Andrew. So our first comment from the Facebook live stream, excuse me, I'm looking off my other screen here. This one comes from Carl, and Carl asked, what is the current general risk and or volume of effluent escaping into the Columbia River? What are the measures taken to identify leaks? So I'm not sure which one of you guys might be the best one to answer that one.
So any effluent that comes from a number of facilities or activities on the Hanford site that reach the LERF basins for storage and then ETF for disposal. As far as identifying leaks, there are groundwater monitoring wells that are in place currently around the facility to ensure that if there were any leaks from the basins themselves, that can be determined that there is a release or not. As far as reaching the Columbia River, the only discharges from the ETF facility is through the wastewater discharge permit, and that wastewater is determined to be non-hazardous prior to being discharged in those verification tanks.
Awesome. Thanks, Eddie. And Ginger, I see you're back on. Do you want to go ahead?
I'm back on. Sorry about that. Pet sitting, and unfortunately, my friend just dropped off her critter. So the next question is, how long does a typical campaign last?
Good question. Evaporator campaigns are again designated prior to the start of the campaign. A typical campaign runs from 30 hours to 4 or 5 days long to reach a specific concentration at the end. And that's all determined by how aggressively they heat the waste, how quickly they introduce new feed and siphon off processed slurry. There's a bunch of factors that determine that. How much tank waste they're treating determines a lot about how long the campaign will run, but somewhere between 2 and 5 or 6 days.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Andrew. And I'll again offer up, if anybody wants to ask their question live, turn on your audio or camera, you're more than welcome to do so. Feel free to either put into the chat that you want to, or I'll take a moment, just about 10 seconds here. If anybody wants to unmute and ask a question, you're more than free to do so now. And I'll go ahead and give like 10 seconds, and then we can move into a Facebook question if nobody asks one. Jerry, I see you have your video on. Do you have a question?
Yes, thanks.
No worries.
Thanks for the explanation. And I've got a couple of questions. The first one is on the list of, excuse me, I need a drink of water. Sorry. On the list of sources, there was transfer line from 200 West, and that confused me because I thought that the line was inoperable from 200 West. And what kind of waste would be coming from 200 West?
So I can say that I do not exactly know if it's operational. I'm going to let Amina chime in if she has that answer. I appreciate it, Amina.
Hi, everyone. This is Amina Maina. I'm the permit lead and engineer for LERF. So Jerry, thank you for your question. I think that transfer line is actually used for to transfer all the pump and treatment of water from 200 West to LERF.
So this is not tank waste transfer line. This
No.
Okay.
No.
Great. Thank you.
You.
That makes it much more clear for me. My second question has to do with permitting for transfer lines, and could you describe for the lines going into both facilities, what kind of leak detection do we have, and is it basically, is it only at endpoint, or do we have leak detection and cathode protection as well for all the lines entering for their entire length?
I can start, since it's in higher in elevation, I can start at the 242A evaporator. We have transfer lines from the DST system, which provide feed and then transfer slurry back to the DSTs from the evaporator. Those are administratively DST components. So they're needed. There are points where two systems, DST's evaporator, work together. There's an administrative point where,
and DST, for folks who aren't familiar, is double shell tanks. Right?
Yes, thank you, Jerry.
Yeah, you bet.
So there's an administrative point where those DST components become evaporator components and are then described and permitted under the purview of the evaporator permit. For the feed and slurry lines, those are actually being replaced right now. The old lines did not have compliant penetrations, secondary containment while they were penetrating the evaporator wall. And so DOE put in permit mods, this is a couple of years ago, and started construction of these new lines. These are metal lines, and leak detection for these lines are provided at the low point at the DST system in the transfer pits. And those are cathodically protected the entire length of the line for those, because they are metal underground transfer lines. And then I think where Jerry's getting a lot of this, these questions are ones that ecology has had for the last few years and are working through in current permit modifications at the evaporator and at LERF for transfer lines going down to the basins from the evaporator WTP. And originally those were permitted with a single low point. These are long lines, more than a mile long lines that transfer these different aqueous effluents down to LERF basins, and originally only had a single low point electronic leak detection system that was functional. These lines have had iterations upon iterations of different leak detection capabilities, all of which had shown to be unreliable. At one point, there was a leak detection strip that ran the entire 5,000 feet or so of transfer line, and any drop of water or liquid along that line would cause it to alarm. And being underground, a problem with these transfer lines is condensation, and so they'd be false alarms. Right now, we are working on requiring DOE to install additional leak detectors along the lines, both from WTP and from the evaporator down to LERF, essentially more than 4 times the leak detection capability of the single low point leak detector down at the bottom. And the transfer lines, at least the evaporator components, and I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Amina, but the evaporator components from evaporator and WTP down to the LERF basins are fiberglass reinforced plastic and do not require cathodic protection because they would not deteriorate under those conditions.
Thank you for explaining that, and you know, for the really important work of making sure that there's adequate leak detection on such long.
You want the next one, Ryan, or I've got one?
Sure. Yeah, I got a couple on Facebook here. This question comes from Susan Leckband on Facebook, and Susan asks, have any of the LERF basins leaked contaminated waste into the soil column?
So in the short time that I've been with ecology and when I was an inspector and inspecting the LERF basins in ETF, at least I don't recall any records of leaks from the basins themselves. Amina, do you have anything in regards to that in your permitting work that you've come across?
No, not really. So we have monitoring wells, for each of the basin, which actually has a monitoring system for some analyte to kind of check if those components or contaminants are which are actually present in the basin, which if those contaminants are present in the monitoring wells, then that will actually prove that the basins are leaking. But we don't have any kind of proof or anything to show the basins are leaking or any, yeah.
Thanks, Amina. Let's see, Matthew Campbell asked, Matthew, do you want to ask your question live? Wonder if you're, let's see, I don't see your name. Let's see.
I guess
Oh,
I
there
could.
you are. You could. You might as well ask your own question since it's long.
Oh, sure. So the DF law is going to produce a lot of different condensate and liquid waste just from the aspect of the high heat and the glass creation, the vitrification. So I mean, there's thousands of gallons. I think one section of the train is rated for expecting to possibly pull in condensate about 3,500 gallons a day. So what's the capacity for the effluent treatment facility? I'm guessing it's higher than that, but I was just curious.
I can take the question, Eddie. So this is Amina again. So each of the LERF basin, the volume is 7.8 million gallon. So right now, there are like 3 operating basins. So it's about like 23 million gallon. Sorry, I should have said million. Sorry about that. Yeah, 23 million gallon. But adding the 4th basin, the basin 41, when Eddie showed his presentation, you must have seen there is a basin that is under construction. We permitted that basin last year, so the permittees are working on it. That basin will be operating in operation soon. That basin actually they have constructed to support the effluent coming from WTP operations. So with that, with the 4th basin, the total LERF basin capacity would be like around 32 million gallon. So that should cover the whole additional liquids coming from WTP.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for that. I guess I apologize. Maybe my question was more related to the waste treatment capacity at ETF for DF law.
Oh, okay. Sorry,
That's okay.
And yeah, so the waste treatment capacity. The regular campaign DOE, has right now is about 1 million gallon per year, but with WTP being operation, that might change. But they hope that they can cover it, and there are new treatment units that are being installed to support the WTP aqueous waste. So yeah, I think that's sufficient to treat the liquid waste from WTP. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much.
Awesome, and thank you, Matthew, for turning your camera. We love seeing folks too, so that's great. So we appreciate that. Next question. This one we're gonna skip back over to Facebook, and Susan asked another question for us. And Susan asks, are the delisted wastes also non-radioactive as well as declared non-dangerous? And let me go ahead and ask that one more time. Susan asked, are the delisted wastes also non-radioactive as well as declared non-dangerous?
Sorry about that. Can you repeat that one more time?
Yeah. Are the delisted wastes also non-radioactive as well as declared non-dangerous?
So the delisted waste, I believe she's talking about the waste that goes into the verification tanks. Yes, whatever's in the verification tanks after going through the primary treatment train would be non-hazardous and would have all those constituents removed for them. And then verification would happen prior to going out in the wastewater discharge permit.
Okay. Let's see. How about Jeff Wyatt asked, have air emissions from LERF basins been characterized?
So Amina, correct me if I'm wrong in regards to this, but the basins themselves have covers.
That's right, Eddie. Yeah.
Yeah, so the covers would prevent the basins themselves being emission units under our Hanford air operating permit. There are some new source reviews that have to be done, which have just recently gone through for Basin 41 when it comes to construction of the basin and the operation of the basin. On top of those new source reviews, they have to submit a notice of construction application to ecology, which also falls under the waste management section in the air project. And during those, when we receive those applications, we process them and review them and provide approval orders for those construction activities and eventually the operation of that basin as those conditions are rolled into the air operating permit for the Hanford site.
Awesome. Thank you both. I do see we've got Dan Solitz in queue to be on audio and video. Dan, I'll go ahead and go to you next after this next Facebook question. So this question comes from Jason, and Jason asks, what happens with the slurry that doesn't evaporate in the evaporator system?
The tank waste that does not evaporate and get condensed and sent down to the LERF basins, that tank waste is then transferred back to the DST system and then stored in the DST system.
Awesome. Thank you, Andrew. So we'll go ahead and go back to our live audio / video questions. Dan, I see you put yourself in the queue. Do you have a question for our presenters?
Yes, I think so. It might be a little out of your bailiwick, but I'm wondering how much cross-training is going on between the VAP folks, the plant operator, and the Liquid Effluent Treatment Facility folks. I mean, how much familiarity do you think they have with what each other is doing? Because they're all really intertied.
I can answer that in part. And I assume, Dan, that you're asking about facility personnel and not ecology personnel.
Right, the operators themselves.
Yeah, so the facilities the operations manager for the contractor is the same for both the evaporator and LERF. I also know that the control rooms are tied in. And so a signal that is received at the evaporator, certain signals at the evaporator, like leak detectors along the transfer lines, are received at both the LERF and evaporator control rooms. I'm pretty sure at least during transfers, those personnel are very familiar with both the evaporator and the LERF operations at those transfer points. But yeah, they are inextricably linked, and I know that the LERF and evaporator personnel have some middle ground where they work together. And like I said, the facilities listed here, his name is James Foster. He is the 200 East area operations manager or facilities manager. So he manages all of the 200 East area, DST's evaporator and LERF functions.
So we had a question, Anthony asked, so by heating and cooling radioactive waste, radioactive waste is turned into non-radioactive waste, and Jerry offered an answer. This is all in the chat. No, radioactive waste is always radioactive until it decays, and the length of time of decay depends on the half-life of each element and isotope. So cesium-137 loses half of its radioactivity in 30 years, while plutonium-239 has a half-life of 24,000 years. So it's still radioactive. Do we know, like, what elements and how does, so I'm going to ask this question. It's still radioactive, but do the different radioactive elements have any bearing on the speed of the campaign, or is it mostly just like how thick the slurry is when it arrives? Or
so very, very good question. I don't know if I have the greatest of answers for it. Our office and our regulations are only covering the dangerous waste constituents in the tank waste, and they don't cover the radionuclide components of these wastes. However, those radionuclides are considered in all kinds of things, criticality, flammable gas generation, things that may affect dangerous waste management. And so DOE manages radioactive components under different regulations. My understanding is that the evaporator treatment does not evaporate much of the radioactive components. Nearly all of those remain in the tank waste slurry and are transferred back to the tank waste. Small amounts may get over into the process condensate, and I'm not quite sure how those are regulated underneath from DOE's standpoint. But yes, Jerry's got a good point. Half-life decay is the essentially only way you can get rid of radioactivity. And essentially the WTP's purpose is to contain that radioactivity in as solid and as contained form as possible, so that waste can undergo all of its decays into a more stable, stable, whatever, how you want to
form.
say it. Stable form.
Stable form
you. Thank
that
you.
hopefully can't get into the environment.
Thank you, Andrew. I'm looking on Facebook right now. I don't think I see any new questions on the chat. I'll throw another pitch, and if anybody has any questions, please feel free to put them into the Facebook chat if you're on Facebook, or into the Zoom chat if you're on Zoom. You're also more than welcome to turn on your audio and your video if you're on the Zoom version of the call. I'll go ahead and offer another 10 or 15 seconds here. If anybody wants to ask their question live, if anybody has any questions they want to ask again, feel free to go ahead and unmute yourself right now if you have a question. If you don't, that's okay. We have another pre-submitted question I can ask if we don't get any questions in the next 10 or so seconds, but I'll go ahead and offer an opportunity for folks to ask their question live if they want to. Okay, I'm not seeing anybody quite yet, so I'll go ahead and ask one quick question. I do see, I think we had a question in the chat on Zoom. Do we have another one in the Zoom chat, Ginger? Or maybe Facebook. Sorry, I am looking at all the different questions we have here. I'll go ahead and ask this one pre-submitted question we have while I track down this rogue question on Facebook. This question was asked, what is the definition of aqueous?
I could try. I'm not a chemist by education. I have taken some chemistry. I think aqueous means dissolved in water. So I think a liquid form is essentially how aqueous can be translated.
Awesome, thanks, Andrew. Dana, I see you messaged me about the Facebook question. For some reason, I don't think I can see it. Do you have that question handy that you could ask for us that you found on Facebook, Dana?
Sure, I have it. Jason asks, it says, it looks like the basins of the LERF are open to the environment and contain contaminants. If this is so, how do you keep wildlife out of it to eliminate cross-contamination?
Yeah, so the basins themselves, as they appear from that aerial photo, they could look like they're open to the environment, but they do have a cover on top of those basins to ensure that the aqueous waste that's stored in there remains in there.
And nothing can land in it because there's a
Yes.
cover. Is there also a fence, I would imagine, so that deer don't try to walk across the top or something?
It's been quite some years since I've been out to LERF ETF, so I can't recall if there's a fence, but we do have some security protocols within our permit that would hopefully prohibit wildlife and other people from getting into areas that they're not supposed to be into. Yes.
Awesome. Ginger, do you see any other Zoom questions yet? Alrighty, and I don't think I've seen any on Facebook, but to be safe, Dana, do you see any others I missed on Facebook, since that one didn't appear to me for some reason? Do you see any others I may have missed?
No, the only other statement is Susan Leckman thanking us for all of our clear answers.
Thanks, Susan. All right, well, I'll go ahead and give everybody one more chance to ask any questions you have. If you're on the Facebook or Zoom chat, go ahead and put your questions into the chat. I'm also going to offer another opportunity for folks to unmute and turn on their cameras if they want to ask us their question directly here on the Zoom version of the chat. While I'm waiting for that to happen, I'll go ahead and offer up that there are currently 3 comment periods open that involve LERF, ETF, or the 242A evaporator. I'll put that link into the Zoom chat and the Facebook chat here in a second. We also have another comment period that's opening tomorrow, and then there'll be another comment period opening, I think, here in a couple weeks, involving these facilities as well. But so please, if you want to, go ahead and go on our website. Some of them are DOE comment periods. We have some of ours, but go ahead and you can check out the comment period, submit your questions about those specific comment periods. And again, I'll link that into the chats here before the end of the night. But with that being said, I'll go ahead and offer another opportunity for folks to unmute if they have any other last minute questions they'd like to ask. So I'll go ahead and leave it open for a couple seconds if anybody has a question.
All right. Well, we don't have an episode for April, so we will hopefully see you in May. And I want to thank everybody for attending. And I don't know if she would like to turn on her camera and wave at folks, but we rely a great deal on Dana. She's kind of our wizard behind the curtain. She makes sure our slideshows are perfect and readable and clear and concise. And there's Ms. Dana.
Dana.
Thank you, Dana. And thank you everybody else for coming and for your good questions. I think some of them were good for us to hear the questions too, because it made us think of things we maybe haven't considered. And the recording will be up by tomorrow on our ecology YouTube channel. And please reach out with any further questions. And Ryan, do you have any other things? Oh, Eddie and Andrew.
Yeah, I was just going to note, a huge thank you again to Andrew, Eddie, and Amina all for hopping on tonight. And if do you guys have any last minute thoughts on these facilities or how the public can get involved with any of these?
No, I appreciate you putting in the link for the public comment periods. We appreciate all the feedback that we get from folks on these facilities and others on the Hanford site.
Yeah, and I wanted to second that sentiment that we rely really heavily on the public. A big part of our duty is to be the forward-facing operations out at Hanford, be as transparent as we can, and we really appreciate all the public engagement.
Awesome. Amina, do you have any final thoughts?
I'd like to thank everyone who joined, and thank you so much for all your questions. Those are very valuable for us and, performing our job. Yeah, thank you so much.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, everybody, for your questions tonight. They're really awesome. It's great to see some of your faces on the Zoom chat. Like Ginger said, we're not going to have an April topic, but we hope to have one for early to mid-May. So stay tuned for information about that topic. We're currently planning it. We'll announce it soon. And again, the Facebook recording will be available, I think, within the next hour. Facebook just needs to buffer the recording. And I will have the recording up on YouTube tomorrow, so stay tuned for that. And we'll also get the slides up on the website as well. So stay tuned for all of that, and I think we're probably good to call it night. Thanks again, everybody.